Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unmatched. Today, I'm with Alex M.H. Smith. He's the author of No Bullshit Strategy, an amazing book that I got through my holidays just recently, and it was just an amazing discovery. And he's also the founder of Basic Arts, where he develops breakthrough strategy for consumer brands. Alex, I'm so happy to have you today on Unmatched.
Oh, well, very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to show the book because I've raved about it on my LinkedIn with my friends. I've recommended to everyone. And it's been such a great discovery for me too, because I think it's one of the best, simply sort of explained books about what strategies is all about. But before we go into all that, tell us a little bit about who you are and why you do what you do.
Well, I mean, I am if I want to turn people off at a dinner party, then I can just say I'm a strategy consultant, but which is technically true. But of course, then you get people say, "What do you mean? What do you mean strategy consultant?" So it's a really terrible thing to say, but that ultimately is what I do. But recently, I've had a lot of sort of media traction with the book and with sort of stuff on LinkedIn and going viral and things like that. So I suppose I have this sort of secondary career as being a sort of strategy demystifier for people. And I think that's really important because one of the interesting characteristics of strategy, unlike other disciplines, I would say, is that it's something that people have to do for whom it is not their day job. So if we take design for sake of argument, the only people really doing design mostly are designers. Like your average CEO does not need to do design. They can pay someone else to do design for them. But strategy, well, I know that there are people like me who have strategy in their job title, but most strategy is done by people who are not strategy experts and who don't have any sort of strategy qualification or knowledge. Most founders aren't strategy experts. Most chief executives aren't strategy experts. And these are the people who are actually making strategic decisions day in, day out. So what you need really, in my view, is a way to make people like this be really sort of like hot on strategy without them having to go and study an MBA or like dig deep into the weeds, because ultimately sorry because ultimately they don't have time for that, and they've got their head on a lot of other things other than strategy. So I suppose that what I've become is a person who can kind of give people very fast understanding of the most important tenets of strategy so that they can actually do it in their day-to-day lives without actually going and having to be some sort of like strategy boffin. And honestly, I believe it is like really simple, basic stuff. And actually, I would almost go so far as to say that I don't think there should even be such thing as a person with strategy in their job title or like being a strategy expert. It's just because it's something that people have to do within the confines of another job. Just being about strategy in the abstract is kind of meaningless. It's always like strategy within a context. So yeah, that's kind of what No Bullshit Strategy is all about. I was a bit like, all right, well, in 100 odd pages, can I tell someone everything they need to know where basically they will be 90% as good as someone who's done an MBA and really thought about this? And that's the kind of concept.
You know, I love that you started with this idea of a dinner party and then you'd introduce yourself as a strategy consultant, because you don't strike me as the McKinsey type, right? I mean, no offense to anyone working at McKinsey, but when I think about a strategy consultant, that's kind of the idea that I have in my mind, yet you make it look so simple and so approachable. And I think, to your point, it is really not as difficult as we want to make it look. Why did you decide to write a book about strategy in the first place, and why No Bullshit?
Well, the honest answer is that when you're a consultant, if you have a book, you think, well, no one's going to read it, but people will think, oh, then I look smart, and then I can charge more fees. So that's the only reason I wrote it. Didn't have some sort of grand
I love the honesty.
altruistic motivation for it. And of course, I was fully prepared for not a single person to buy it or read it, and it would have still been fine. It would have still done the job. It would have still been like, oh, Alex Smith, author, da da da. And then when it came to the actual concept of the book itself, it was really just, again, being frank, it was what is the easiest thing that I could write? I mean, I wrote the whole book in like a week, maybe. So it was really just what is the thing that I could just sit down and write without doing any research or any thinking, just let it flow. And obviously, because I've been doing the sort of like the strategy work for companies for a while, it's basically just putting onto paper, what my experience is and how I think it works and what the most important sort of things for people to know are. So it's only after the fact that I can post-rationalize the whole sort of like wider strategy around my own business, which has also come out of all of the traction I've been getting online, which I didn't have when I wrote the book. So now everything's kind of coming together. But at the time, I can't pretend that it was like a well laid out plan. And of course, this is one of the main sort of lessons about strategy that I talk about in the book and elsewhere, that it is an emergent thing, and that you don't sit down with a blank sheet of paper and plan out this perfect future. I actually think it's much more a backwards-looking discipline than a forwards-looking discipline. It's much more about making sense of all the pieces that you've built up and all the sort of like the crap that's on the table, and saying, what is this thing really? And then once you've found an answer to that, then you can push forward deliberately in that direction. That is really how it works. It isn't so the book, now I can tell a story about the book, about how it all fits into the Alex Smith grand master plan, and it does. But that isn't because I planned that to begin with. It's just because now I have found a way of integrating the book into something bigger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be honest, I think that we think about strategy in a very complex manner, and we make it more difficult because of that. I think sometimes when you're not sure about your next steps, you just need to take the next step and see where it takes you. And then looking back, to your point, you can analyze it again and put it into a context. Yet, you help founders and consumer brands come up with a strategy. And I wonder, I'm sure that the title comes from your own experience of maybe probably working on many, many different strategies for different companies and noticing them to be a lot of BS. So why no BS? Why do we need a no BS strategy, and how does that help companies do better?
Well, strategy is, I would say, the number 2 most bullshit word in business. The number 1 probably being insight. I think that insight is marginally more bullshit.
I thought it was authenticity.
No, that's number 3. That's number
okay. So we have the top 3 now.
Which I think is like, I mean, what is the literal definition of bullshit? The literal definition of bullshit is, a bunch of sort of fancy sounding words which kind of seem good at first glance, but actually on closer inspection mean nothing. And I think this is exactly what most things that the label strategy gets applied to are. I'm not sure that this is a really extreme thing to say, but I think it might be true. I'm not sure I've ever had somebody explain to me their quote unquote strategy and it's been anything other than some sort of form of bullshit. I mean, it really is just completely it's just a completely vacuous concept, mostly because people apply the word strategy to things which are not actually strategies. It's not that, I often say that we don't have a problem with a whole bunch of people out there doing bad strategies. we have a problem with people out there doing no strategy at all.
At all.
That, like, in fact, I would almost go so far as to say I'm not sure there is such thing as a bad strategy. If you've made something which is genuinely a strategy, you are so far ahead of the curve. Like, the actual content of the strategy is almost kind of like a secondary consideration. But mostly, I think most people are vaguely aware of the problems that you get. So a very classic one would be, I think probably the two main classic ones would be people describing goals or aspirations and saying that they're a strategy. Our strategy is to, double our turnover, or our strategy is to become, number one in our market, that kind of thing. And then the other one would be strategy, which is essentially non-actionable, so sort of vague waffle. So something like, our strategy is to serve the customer better and better every day, or something like that. And you say, well, I'm sure that if you did that, that would be fine. But how are you going to do that? Like, the strategy is the how, the strategy is the substance. Saying our strategy is to serve our customer better, for sake of argument, that's just another version of laying out a goal or an aspiration. Like, strategy always has to have the quality of a solution. We are going to do X. And whoever you tell that to, it's completely unambiguous, and they get it. And they're like, oh, right. Yeah, no, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. Right. But strategy, it almost never reaches that level of specificity or actionability to do that. Normally, things that people call strategies, they're actually just concepts which require a second strategy to execute,
Yeah.
If someone has to ask the question, oh, okay, how? It's not a strategy, right?
Yeah.
But almost always the things that people call strategies, they provoke the question of, oh, okay, how do we do that? And in which case, you have no strategy. All you have is a differently articulated objective.
And I love that you touched on this. I often think that people jump right into tactics, and they think that strategy before they even think about their objectives, right? So I think that's where a little bit the mistake comes from people and founders and companies, that, there is a sort of thinking process around it, and people just like to jump directly to the end, because the actionable pieces are the most, are the easiest for people to understand and deal with. But to your point in the book, which is something that I really, really love the way you framed it, is strategy is about transformation. So basically it takes you from point A to point B, and it forces you to think how you want to transform yourself, your business, in order to get there. Tell us a little bit about that differentiation between, objectives, strategy, and tactics.
Yeah. Well, just on that point there about the transformation, someone, they said that they were quoting me back at myself, and maybe they were, but actually I can't remember ever saying this. But regardless of whether I said it or they said it, I don't know. I thought it was quite good, where they said that, like, one good definition of strategy is just how you are going to change. And so it's a point which is so obvious that people don't even bother thinking about it, but it would solve a lot of problems. Where if you think, okay, my strategy is how I'm going to change, it therefore demands that you explain some form of shift in the business from point A to point B. Not how my results are going to change, but how I'm actually going to change the business itself. And so most of the time, the big issue that you have is that people actually, they don't actually do anything to genuinely change the business. They say a strategy, but everything just continues going the way it was, in which case, whatever they said, it doesn't matter how clever it is, it was completely meaningless. So that is a really good way of thinking about it. Now, objectives, I actually have a sort of controversial view on objectives, which is that I just don't bother with them. I just don't think about objectives at all, because very simplistically, I think that all businesses' objectives are fundamentally the same, and you can cut them up whichever way you want, but they all pretty much boil down to sort of selling more stuff. And sometimes I think that there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, I sort of think I don't really care how you cut your objective. It's always kind of going to be about how can we take this thing, this business, and make it into a more healthy, more vibrant, more sort of thriving and sort of progressing version of itself possible. And so, however we define that probably isn't going to make that much difference to how you do that. So, uh, so actually, I would go further. I would say that every single business has got the same objective, and that objective is to generate value. And I think this is the right mindset to enter into the process. If you enter into the process and you say, okay, our objective is to double our turnover, let's say, that's a bad mindset to enter into, because you're going to start coming up with strategies or solutions that are kind of trying to sort of shortcut the process to doubling your turnover. And those will probably be quite bad strategies. However, if you enter the strategic process thinking, okay, our strategy is to increase the value that the business produces, then, of course, over time, you will also increase the value that the business collects as well. But that mindset, that's the correct mindset in order to come up with good strategies, because all any business ever is, when all is said and done, is it's a value creation system, right?
But one question there. Do you think about value as sales, or do you think about value as a more holistic concept? Because, I mean, I think here, my experience has been that most of the companies that I look at are looking at objectives as to, we need to sell more, right? And I think that when I think about value, it has to be more than that. I mean, how can you sell more if you're not creating more value for the consumers in some kind of other way? Right? Like, if you don't connect with them in a way that is meaningful for them, then you're not going to really increase your sales. So how do you look about that part of value creation?
Well, yeah, it's exactly what you say, that there are ways to get more sales and to get more revenue without creating more value. But these are, I think, largely short-termist, or in some cases even perhaps unethical. The only sustainable and ethical way of increasing your sales is to increase the value that you put out there. It's like, I mean, it's very obvious, really. The more value you put out, the more value you're going to collect. And you should not be thinking too much about the collection side of that equation. You should only be thinking about the value provision side of that equation. And all strategy, in my view, is geared towards generating that value, so that obviously then you can collect it afterwards. So that's the really good starting point for any sort of like strategic thinking, is simply, how can we create more value? So if you take any business, they're thinking about their strategy, they're trying to generate their strategy. Where do they start? I would say they just have to start with the assumption, okay, we are creating, let's call it, because they want to move forward, right? So let's say that whatever the situation they're in now, they say, we are creating a mediocre amount of value, right? Let's score ourselves 5 out of 10 for the value that we're creating. What could we do to push that up to 10 out of 10? And whatever the answer is to that question, well, that's the strategy, because then you go and do that thing, and then you're giving more value, and then more money will come in, and then you'll grow. And so what more really is there to the whole game than that? In my view, there isn't anything more to the game than that. And you can dress it up any way you want, but it's all just overly complicated versions of the same story. Now, of course, what does value look like? That is the complicated, difficult question, which is going to be different in different markets, different for different businesses. You know, one business's form of value could be that you invent a widget which is just like 5 times cheaper than the other widgets on the market, and that's going to be enough to kind of like get you huge advantages. At the other end of the spectrum, it might be something really soft and psychological and brandy, like Nike or whatever, and it might be much, much more emotional than practical. And I think it's very important not to view these as being different things. The cheap widget and the Nike t-shirt, they are the same, right? And they are doing the same thing, and they are operating to the same principles. The fact that one of them is doing it with a sort of different flavor of value than the other one. This is a distraction if you start trying to separate these things, which is why, like, the whole world of branding, I find it to be quite I find it to be quite problematic and unhelpful in the strategy process, because the truth is that, like, the way that a given business is putting value into the market, that is, sometimes it's going to be very heavily leaning on brand, and sometimes it's not going to be leaning on brand at all.
Yeah.
And you need to be agnostic about that when you're going into the process. And the problem is that, like, if you're so some people completely disregard it in their strategic thinking, and they think, oh, we'll do the branding later, without realizing that it might be an important component. And other people think that it's all about branding, and they forget all of the practical hard forms of leverage, which are, to be honest, where you get the most defensible and powerful strategies. And they just jump straight to, how can we make this thing look sexy? Both of these are really, really bad ways of looking at the game. Because like I say, this is the unfortunate thing with that word value, but it can look so different for different businesses.
Now, I think it's linked to what you just said. In the book, you talk about this idea of becoming the only, not the best. And I feel it has to do a little bit with what we just talked about, in terms of the value creation and what it stands for. What do you mean with that?
So you're trying to create value. You're trying to create as much value as you can. There are two sides to this equation. Side number one is, are you actually doing something that people want, or that people see value in, or that people find helpful, right? That's the obvious side. If you create a company that does something which nobody wants, then it's not going to be very successful. The other side, which people are worse at, is it also something they can't get from anywhere else? Because the problem is that if you create a business that provides value that there is clear demand for, but people can get that exact same value from lots of other places, then you find yourself in a competitive context. Then you become commodified. Then you have to lower your prices, because obviously the customer has got all the power in that relationship. And then you quickly become unprofitable. So offering value that people can get in lots of other places, in my book, is the same as offering no value at all. Okay, it's not quite as bad, to be fair, but it's almost as bad, right? So the only way that you're really going to win the game is if that value is in some way unique, or at least has the perception of uniqueness. So most businesses' problem, generally speaking, I would suggest, is that they do offer genuine value, but it's just value that can be got in lots of places. Yeah. And so then they have to play all the competitive games. They have to spend more on marketing. They have to cut their prices. They have to hustle. They have to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they have to find any little way they can to squeeze out an inch over the competition. If you were the only person giving the value that you're giving, then you wouldn't have to worry about any of that, and you just start making money basically automatically. And when we look at all the big, sexy, strategic case studies in history, this is what happened. I mean, a great way of visualizing it actually is if you think about, like, the iPhone. At one point in history, it had something like 15% market share, so it was by no means the biggest phone in the market in terms of market share. But it had 79% profit share. So for every pound of profit made in that market, 79p was going to Apple. Now, how do you turn 15% market share into 79% profit share? Well, the answer is that that people thought that the iPhone was not a comparable product with the other products in that space. Although technically it had competitors, in practice it didn't have competitors. People thought, if I want what the iPhone gives, I can only take the iPhone. I can't go and take an LG or something like that. This is not a substitutable thing. And that is therefore then how obviously Apple made a lot of money. So that is the dynamic that you are chasing, right?
Yeah.
And that is the dynamic that you can achieve if you manage to hit that rarefied spot of unique value, which, like I say, is the entire focus of the strategic endeavor.
And on that point, I guess the question would be how do you find that unique value, right? So I think that a lot of businesses tend to look outside of themselves. I think one of the issues that I see with this kind of unique positioning, I call it the unmatched positioning, is that people tend to look outside of their competitive landscape. They look at their competitors. They try to benchmark themselves with all these different competitors, and then they're thinking, okay, like, let's take a little bit of this, let's take a little bit of that from that competitor, and then we mix it all up, and then all of a sudden we're unique. Now, I don't think that that's how it works. I think that, in my opinion, it's more about looking inwards. And I guess every consumer brand, and if we're talking about consumer brands specifically right now and not commodity-based businesses, a good consumer brand will have some kind of components, will have some kind of founder story, will have some kind of heritage, will have some kind of ingredients that are authentic to that, and sorry for that, the BS word. But there will be ingredients that every brand will already have in order to, mix them all up and come up with that unmatched positioning. What's your opinion on that? How do we find that unique value?
Yes, so I completely agree with the sentiment of what you're saying. Now, in terms of looking outside of the brand, first of all, you do need to do that, but you just need to do it in exactly the opposite way that most people do it. Every brand exists in a competitive context or in a cultural context. It exists in a context in general. So you need to know what the context is that you're fitting into. It's like putting a jigsaw piece into an empty hole in a jigsaw. You need to know what the shape of that hole is. You can't just like be any shape you want. You do need to be responsive to the environment. So generally speaking, the pattern that you see is that you look at the competitors, but you look at the competitors explicitly to tell you what not to do, right?
Correct.
The competitors are creating negative space for you to fit into. So whatever the competitor is doing, whatever the competitor is good at, you're like, okay, that's good knowledge. I won't do that, right? So that's the first thing, right? So you do absolutely need to be looking externally, but you just need to be looking externally for the negative space, not to copy. Then, to your point about looking internally, now look, it is theoretically possible to come up with a sort of blue sky idea, which is going to be incredible, and maybe you find it in some like sort of customer research or whatever it is, and you implement it and then you fly. That can happen. It's just would be quite unusual, though. The much more reliable and common and effective way of developing the strategy is that you are looking for the unique qualities and unique forms of value that your business is already kind of offering, but probably doing it sort of accidentally or unintentionally. So if the business is already making sales, making profit, then you can infer that this business is already providing some form of unique value, even if it's very sort of subtle and sloppy. You just need to sort of isolate that and then really lean into it and accelerate it, because it's very, very hard to, in my view, to change a business from being one thing into being another thing. Most great strategic success stories involve, I would describe it more as a kind of a blossoming of what the business already was.
Like an evolution.
Becoming a more intense and vivid and purposeful and focused version of what it already was. And that thing that it already was, this is the crucial point, almost certainly is not what the founder or the management or whatever of the business intended, right? The initial version of the business that goes out in the market is just a prototype. It's just your first gambit to get into the game. Then the business will evolve in a sort of self-willed fashion almost, and you can then start to listen and have the business tell you what it sort of wants to become.
Yeah.
And that thing that it wants to become will naturally match the negative space in the market, because it's like water finding the fastest way downhill. The business is going to find the fastest way to sort of fit into the negative space in the market. A business will not naturally gravitate towards a crowded part of the market, because obviously it's going to be sort of pushed away by the forces of all the other businesses there. A business, if you listen to it very, very closely, is going to gravitate towards the empty parts of the market. And this is why it's so sort of stupid what you see happening in a lot of businesses, where they are copying other things in the market, and they're almost dragging their business, kicking and screaming, away from a strategic position and towards an unstrategic position. And you really actually do see this happening, like quite vividly sometimes. So I do think it is actually helpful to think about the business as having a discrete identity, almost like a personality, which is separate from the people from the people running it. It is once it exists, it does have a sort of life force of its own, and if you act as if that is true, then it will really help sharpen your perceptions.
Yeah, which is, I guess, the most difficult part, to separate what the business truly is from what the opinions of the top management / founder / CEO, whatever that is because those are very subjective opinions, but the reality of the market tells you maybe completely something different. Now, this leads to my next question. This is something that I loved in your book, the Subjectivity Test. You say that you must remove all subjective language from your strategy and see what's left. What is subjective language? Anything that's in the eye of beholder, anything that's a judgment, words like good, great, incredible, world-class, best, smart. I mean, that made me laugh so hard, because, I mean, who hasn't heard those words in a strategy before? And I think this comes from exactly what you were saying before, the subjective opinions of top management and what they personally think something is versus what it should be or what the reality is. Why did you feel you wanted to bring this into the book?
I mean, this is like, even when people have read the whole book and they've imbued everything, and you've given them everything that you could possibly give, they still make this error because it's so hard to wriggle out of. And I guess the fundamentals of the error are that, like, a strategy needs to have substance, right?
Mm-hmm.
It needs to actually be this thing, not that thing, right? And the problem with any subjective word, value judgment word, is that it is substance-less, right? So if I explain to you, I don't know, if we say, okay, I've got a chair and I've got an incredible chair, what can you now tell me specifically about the incredible chair?
Nothing.
You can't tell me anything about it. So that word, if this was a strategy for the chair, that word is completely pointless. Yeah. And all it does is it gives the illusion of substance where there is no substance. So when you remove every single word like that from your strategy in any way of sort of describing what your business does, you will be left with the pure source, right, of the pure information of what you're doing. And what you find is that you remove those words, and suddenly, what do you have left? Nothing. This strategy has just vanished. It's just vanished into thin air. There's a very funny Statler ad. How do you say it? The highlighter pens. Is it Statler?
Statler, yeah.
And it has this kind of like piece of corporate jargon, which says something along the lines of, we are a cutting-edge, innovative, forward-looking telecommunications company that serves our partners better and better every day. Some sort of like corporate bollocks like that. And the highlighter pen has just highlighted like the words, we make telecommunications equipment, or whatever it is. Basically, the only actual substantive bits of the sentence, and then the tagline of the ad is "Get to the point." And it's such a
That's
great,
funny.
it's such a great execution of this problem, because it's just sort of like cut through and said the only information you are truly giving me here is that you make telecommunications equipment.
Yeah.
Everything else is it has no substance. So yeah, really, that is the purpose of the exercise. It is to check to see if you actually have any substance at all. I don't really have too much problem with people using those words if they can pass the test of removing them. But that's the problem. Most people can't remove them. You know, if you look at I don't know, like Tesla's strategy, for example, back in the day, which boiled down to starting at the top of the market with a supercar and then progressively working their way down into making cheaper and cheaper, more and more everyday cars. Like that, the substance of that is so binary and unambiguous and clear. And where did I need to tell you that, oh, and these cars will be really good? Like, actually, I didn't. I mean, it doesn't sort of is completely redundant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all I've done is I've just told you the thing that we are going to do that we think is going to work. That's all you have to bloody do with the strategy, right? But we just can't do it. We just can't bring ourselves to just say, we are just going to do this thing which we think might bring positive results. We can't do it because every single thing that we're doing, well, number one, we can't do it because we can't come up with a good idea, probably. So that's the first issue.
Mm.
And the second issue is we can't do it because we are afraid. We are afraid to our bones of actually going out there and making a choice.
Yeah.
Every single thing that people do under the aegis of strategy is basically just a disguised way of delaying a choice. You know, if we say our strategy is to make an incredible chair, for sake of argument, what we're doing there is we are passing the responsibility for choice on to the next person in the chain. So then we go to the guy who's making the chair and we say, all right, make it incredible. Then that guy is the guy who actually has to ask the real question of, well, all right, well, what actually is an incredible chair? So it's all cowardice all the way down. It's sort of unconscious cowardice of like, I do not want to be the person who says, we are going to do X. Because if I'm that person and we do that and it doesn't work, then that's all on me. But if I'm the person who said, hey, our strategy was to make an incredible chair, well, who can blame me? Because, hey, they didn't actually make an incredible chair. They actually didn't follow my strategy. So you know what I mean?
Yeah, and also I would say maybe a third point would be that there's typically a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And so there's like too many opinions for people to kind of align on, and nobody wants to take the responsibility to say, okay, I'll make the decision, you know? Because, you know, for the sake of democracy and because, you know, in big organizations, typically, you know, we have to all work in work streams and have workshops, and we all have to agree on things. And then in the end, it's like a watered down version of maybe a good initial idea, just because we're just too many and we can't decide who should make that decision.
If I've learned one thing, not about strategy per se, but like in being a consultant, is that what people want, what people crave, I mean, people at the top, chief execs and founders and whatever, they are just desperate to have somebody tell them what to do in unambiguous terms.
Mm-hmm.
And really, the only reason I've sort of made a success in some senses out of this career is that, you know, I'm good at some things and I'm bad at some other things. But the one unusual quality that I have, which is so, I don't perceive it as a quality because it's not something that I think about doing, but I suppose I do it, is that I'm very, very comfortable to say to somebody, oh, you should do X. Right? I'm very, very comfortable with doing that. I don't have any fear that X is stupid or that X won't work or whatever. Because at the end of the day, they still have to agree. Like if they do it and it fails, Like they're not
Yeah.
babies. They have to buy into
Sure.
it. Well, they're not just going to do it just because I said it. But what they do want is just somebody to come with the clarity to just say, do X, not Y. And actually, the substance of what X and Y is, like I say, is a little bit secondary to actually just going there and making that call in the first place. Uh, and so, yeah, that's why those sort of like the issues that you're describing about like the sort of the too many cooks and the democracy and stuff like that, nobody wants that, and there's a reason why the
Mm.
archetypal strategists, the big historic figures like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and people like this, there's a reason why they have these really sort of like controversial or even negative reputations. It's because the quality of clear decision making is not actually necessarily a particularly sort of diplomatic or even kind of nice
Mm-hmm.
quality to have.
Mm-hmm.
So like, so people say Steve Jobs was an asshole, and I'm sure he was, but I think that was a feature, not a bug. I don't think you could have had a nice Steve Jobs, because a nice Steve Jobs would have been somebody who didn't go around saying, no, you do this, not that.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because I said so. That is
Yeah.
actually a necessary quality if
Yeah.
you're going to play the game.
I totally agree. Now, this is highly controversial, this point, and this I found it very hilarious in your book. But you say that when we start implementing or when we start writing the strategy, we should actually ditch the deck. And you are very much in favor of the prose sort of direction of explaining strategy internally. And when I read this, I was thinking like, oh, this would never work in big corporations because we love our decks, like we love a good deck. And like, how do you ever even present something to someone if if there's no tangible quote unquote that you can see black on white on a PowerPoint? Now, tell me a little bit about your thinking process when you wrote this, because I found it very, very interesting.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is that I don't object to using decks to present, because that's what decks are, literally the technology of the power of PowerPoint or whatever. It is invented as a presentation aid. So if you're standing up at the company away day and you're telling people what the strategy is, then use a deck, to support the bulk of your presentation, which is obviously going to be the words that you say. What I don't like is when people try to use the deck as the sort of to house the core thinking. Number one, because well, that's just not what the technology is made for. Like Word is for reading, decks are for presenting. Number two, there's something about decks which hides bad thinking, which is why people
Mm-hmm.
like to use PowerPoint instead of Word. It's why people, as a matter of routine, only create their comms in the format of decks and never ever open up Word in their life, in their entire corporate lives. But you want that higher level of standards that Prose provides. You will know when you're writing your strategy as a piece of prose if it's nonsense, because you'll feel embarrassed by it, right? There's no getting away from it. And I think but if you manage it, then you've got a really beautifully disseminatable thing, because there's a reason why books are written in prose, not as PowerPoint decks, right? You don't get
Mm-hmm.
PowerPoint decks as books. It's because a person sitting by themselves and consuming a piece of information, the most effective medium for that is prose. Well, if you're giving out your strategy to people, there's the principles are exactly the same. The most effective medium is prose. But I think another more sort of hidden benefit of it is that a strategy is not a sort of single thing, like a sentence or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Of course, the crux of the strategy could be a sentence. there is a kind of like, there is a sort of bombshell moment where you're saying, and therefore we are going to do this. But really, the strategy is the full rationale and argument leading up to the sentence, and then also the therefores coming after the strategy, i.e., the things that you're going to go and do. So you actually need to have the argument with in order to give the full strategy to someone. So you can't just send somebody a sentence and say, our strategy is to do X. That is completely insufficient. It has to have the preamble explaining why, because no one's going to really be able to imbue and internalize and take ownership of the strategy unless they've been given the full story. And what you find is that if you give somebody the full story, they won't remember the words. You don't want them memorizing, like, our strategy is to do blah, blah, blah. What you want them to memorize is the argument. You want them to memorize the rationale. And you'll actually find that that's like super, super easy to do if you've got a strong argument. And so you only need to tell people once, and they will have that inside them for forevermore. A strong argument, like, it's not, I don't know, it's not a good example, but it's the first thing that springs to mind. Like, anybody who's seen the video or whatever can tell you about Simon Sinek's concept about your why, right? And they can do it because they've seen the argument. They've seen him say, because of X, Y, and Z, this is the type of way that you should be communicating, whatever, right? And then people can do it in their own words, and they can internalize it, and they don't have to think, they don't have to like memorize what he said. So it's the same thing with your strategy. So basically, if you need to put across not just a point, but an argument, well, what is the only coherent format by which you put across an argument? Either verbally or with prose. I would also be, on that basis, if you wanted to record yourself explaining the strategy and have that be the strategy document, I would be fine with that. It would be a little bit cumbersome, but I think that's completely coherent. But most people aren't going to do that. For most people, the word document is much more efficient.
Yeah, which kind of links back to the storytelling aspect of it as well, because if you're able to explain freely your thinking process of how you got to the strategy and what the strategy is, then it's way easier for people to actually understand where you're coming from. Then I guess the deck is all about the execution of it. How are we going to do it, right? But what you're talking about is actually telling the people about the vision and getting them on board. And you can only do that not by looking at some random slides and slide 1 and slide 2 and slide 3, but really, powerfully explaining and getting people onto your side of things, and kind of like having the entire organization, rowing into that same direction.
Yeah. And, like, if once you've written your argument, there's nothing stopping you from literally copy and pasting each sentence and putting them onto slides and then disseminating it that way. That would be a weird thing to do, but it would be fine. So the question is not really whether they're slides or not, but the question is whether or not you have actually laid out a flow, an argumentative flow. And most people are not very good at writing an argumentative flow in a PowerPoint.
Alex, thank you for being on the show today. Congrats on this amazing book. I think everyone should get this book. Honestly, it's on my bookshelf and I go back to it, on a daily, because I think it has so many powerful, nuggets in there that are so simple to understand yet so powerful, because you explain them in such an approachable way. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Oh, no, it was great. Thanks a lot. Absolute pleasure.